It's a pleasure to be here and it's wonderful to see you. Thanks for popping by. Thanks for dropping in. So, my name is John Ferguson. For those who don't know me, I am the practice lead for what we call New Globalisation at Economist Impact. And welcome. You're going to get 2 panels for the price of 1 over the next hour and a half. So, thank you so much for joining us. In terms of structure, I'm going to be talking to these great people for about half an hour about what we call Reinventing Globalisation. Are we set for a new world order? I've got sort of 2 areas to discuss with the team here, and then I'd love your questions. I'll leave 5 or 10 minutes for questions at the end, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Mel, who'll do a deeper dive on the critical topic of sustainability. So globalisation, then sustainability, 2 of the biggest topics that you can imagine. Now, setting up this panel. I wasn't here 10 years ago, but can you imagine if someone said to you 10 years ago that in the following decade we're going to have this strange thing called Brexit, we're going to have a Trump presidency that leads to a US-China trade war, then we're going to have this thing called a global pandemic and our economies are going to be shut down, and then unfortunately there's going to be this land war in Europe. That person would have said a few difficult things to someone like me, but all of those shocks put together, in my view, and maybe some others, has led to a lack of confidence or a questioning of confidence in globalisation. In globalisation and global trade. If we go back to the 2000s and early 2010s, maybe there was a lot more confidence about globalisation. So I really do think we're now at a junction, a crossroad, an inflection point, whatever phrase you want to use for globalisation, that's where we're at. And with these great panellists that I'll introduce in a moment, I really want to talk about 2 areas. The first area is, if we're at an inflection point, what direction are we going in terms of globalisation? There are some difficult paths. And then in the second part, once I've picked their brains, in the second part I want to ask, in those different futures, in those different paths, who are the winners and losers in these different areas? Because I think that's really, really important. I have my own opinions, but this is not about me. This is about our great panellists. So let me just take a seat. I'd like to briefly introduce our great panel here. First of all, let me introduce Rupa Gandhi, who is the president and founder of GEP. A warm welcome, Rupa, and thanks so much for joining us. And next to me, to my left, James Zahn. Thanks so much for joining us. He is the Senior Director for Investment and Enterprise at UNCTAD. Is that how you say it? Oh, that's how I say it. UNCTAD, yes. Which is the UN Conference on Trade and Development. Right. So a really important UN agency who covers this stuff and has done for a long period of time. So we've got a great sort of combination of a private sector perspective and a UN perspective from James as well. So, intro done, tick box. Can I start maybe, Rupa, with you and ask, if we are at a crossroads or an inflection point for globalisation, what could this next chapter look like? People are worried about deglobalisation. The theme of this conference, or Davos, is fragmentation. What do you see for this next chapter of globalisation?
It's a very important question. And people would say it's a possibility. I am an ever optimist.
Great,
so
we need some of that.
I would say probably not.
Probably not deglobalisation, what everyone's worried about?
That's right.
Great,
it's going to be a slightly different
Yep.
structure because clients are looking at overhauling the supply chain. There is a big element of risk, and what gets headlines is the bad news. Mm-hmm. So when you talk about tariffs, when you talk about companies trying to do fabrication in-house versus dependencies on other countries, that gets a lot of press, and rightfully so. But there is other elements. If I look at, so depending on which sector you are in, if I look at technology sector, yes, there is manufacturing coming in-house. There is more regionalization, so things that we would have depended on other countries, we are trying to do it within the region. So Americas, North America, Canada, Mexico. Within Asia, there was a lot of dependency in China. Because of the geopolitical risk, there is maybe depending on some other countries. Maybe Vietnam can come to the forefront, India, Bangladesh, for some of the manufacturing. So I see a little bit of a shift but I don't see necessarily deglobalization.
Right.
Yeah.
I like your optimism. We all need some of that. James, you've been covering this stuff for a very long period of time. I think we had a brief chat out the back there, and you were talking about globalisation moves in long cycles, long periods. And there was, if I can put words into your mouth, a period of hyper-globalisation. Maybe after China joined the WTO, supply chains, and I'm sure Ripper covered this as well in your role, but supply chains just exploded around the world. And geopolitics wasn't a major issue maybe back in the early 2000s. So that was a wonderful period for global companies. But James, we're not really there anymore, are we?
I think so. I agree. We're not there. It's now, I would say, the transformation of the global economic structures and global value chains in at least the decade leading up to 2030 and even beyond. Now, there are four. Now, let's start with this what I call long cycle, as we mentioned. If we look at the last 3 decades, there were 2 decades of rapid growth of globalization and global value chains, followed by 1 decade of stagnation. Started with 2008 global financial crisis. If we look at the data in terms of the average growth rate of trade, investment, technology, productivity, and GVC participation, the last 10 years was basically stagnated with very slow growth compared with the previous 2 decades. So that is one. Now, I think that John, you want to know the next. I would say that would be the next phase, whether you call it globalization, regionalization, or new era of economy, will be driven by 4 mega forces. One is sustainability. The second is geopolitical rivalry. And that will reshape the global economic governance. And the third is new industrial revolution technology will continue. And the fourth is what we call national economic nationalism. That will also. So these are the 4 driving forces that will reshape the global economic structure and global economic governance in terms of, in 4 trajectories. I would say reshoring, regionalization, replication, and diversification. And this will happen. It's because of the 4 driving drivers will change the fundamental determinants of the traditional trade and investment patterns. So efficiency-driven is less important. So that will be kind of from scale to scope. We'll see that happening. We'll also see that in terms of trade, there will be downward pressure on intermediary goods. And in terms of investment, there will be less efficient-seeking FDI, more of market-seeking FDI. And in terms of technology, there will be fragmentation and, of the technological system. That I would say, in terms of supply chain, we'll see the kind of regional-based rather than global-based. So I have to say that's back to the future. If we see the pattern of global supply chain, or we call it's regional-based, it's the US-centric and the European, German, France, and Italy centric, the EU centric, and then we had the kind of Japan centric. The only thing is that China is added to that, and it's reshaped going back to that. But this time is more driven by geopolitics rather than just economic geography. So that's what we see is happening. In terms of policies, we already seen the turning point. If we look at the investment policy, for example, at the national level, in the 1990s and the beginning of the century, the annual kind of development of investment policies, we see the measures introduced, over 95% were in the direction of in favor of investment, international investment and international investors. Now it is less than half. And for that...
So just to explain that,
yeah.
The UN and UNCTAD and James and others look at whether countries' investment policies are favourable to investment coming in, which is a great form of globalisation, or not favourable, if I can summarise that.
Right.
And we've seen a shift a really significant and important shift, which worries people like me. That's why I've got grey hair, right? So this is a worry. I mean, Rupert started being quite optimistic, and I appreciate that.
Yeah.
But James, this has to be a worry. If many more countries are now putting up barriers to investment, and think about all the big global companies here who want to invest globally, if countries are putting up barriers, that's a worry.
Yeah, and also if you look at this is a number in terms of policy measures, but mainly the liberalization facilitation measures are introduced recently by only developing countries. For advanced countries, is the other way, and they account for over 80% of the global investment. And if we talk about the international investment regimes, which in the absence of multilateral investment regime, unlike the global trading system for trade, the current international regime consists of 3,400 investment treaties concluded bilateral, regional, sectoral levels. And in the last decades, there was rapid growth, and in the 1990s, even on average, 2 to 3 treaties concluded per week. Now we see there are more countries terminating investment treaties than concluding new ones. So there are more termination than new treaties. So that's international investment regime is now getting difficulties also.
And think about the uncertainty that creates for global companies.
Right.
You're doing business across borders, whichever border, and the investment regime that you thought was in place that gave you certainty over the rules and the regulations that you were investing in, and these things are now getting...
All bets are off.
All bets are off. So Rupert, I mean, we started off relatively optimistic, but the past 5 minutes, my mood has gone down.
I would still, when I look at companies, when I look at our clients, we are looking at minimizing supply chain risk.
Yep.
Earlier,
because of these trends and factors that James was just talking about.
So earlier it was, I wanted just in time because I want it at the lowest cost possible. The time was not that critical. With the pandemic, with the wars, with the economy, with the geopolitical risk, now companies are looking at just in case, not just in time. So the investments that happen, I can give you an example. So earlier, Costco relied a lot on external logistics providers to ship stuff they got in their warehouses. What do they do now? They invested in their whole logistics network so that they were not reliant on third parties.
Do you mean like what we call insourcing? Do you mean they brought all of this stuff?
Logistics in-house.
Right.
So what they're looking to do is, how do I minimize the risk? What investments do I make? Because you went through a phase, you had scarcity of supplies. We saw that with less toilet paper and hoarding. It went to high prices. It went to identifying different suppliers. All of these companies are taking a much more strategic look. What is my point of failure? Is it a country? Is it an ingredient? Is it a geopolitical hotbed? Is it cyber attacks? So a lot more thinking, and now the environmental impact. So earlier it was okay to ship things from 10,000 miles away, but when you're looking at the carbon emissions, the footprint, there is a lot more thinking, a lot more strategic look. Earlier supply chain wasn't that strategic to many companies. I have seen that change.
But now it is.
It is. It is.
So to answer our question, there is a question mark at the end of this A New World Order. That it's yes. I mean, it's yes. That's why we have a new globalisation practice within Economist Impact, because the answer is yes, by the way. Everything you just said, the investment regimes are changing. People are now doing just-in-case supply chains rather than just-in-time supply chains. Geopolitics is now, you said, one of the fundamental drivers. These things maybe weren't around in the early 2000s when supply chains were just going bang.
On the people side, though,
Yep.
what the pandemic showed us was people did not have to come to a office to work. So companies don't need to invest in expensive real estate in New York City, in Tokyo, in London. They can work from anywhere.
And I guess that's the tech side, right? We've been discussing this within Claudia and the team at Economist Impact. There is a bit of a positive tech story here that it should and will play a role in helping efficiencies and even managing risk. So I don't want to be too doom and gloom, because that
I need to talk about the positive side.
yeah, because that does feel like something that all companies are experimenting with, and for good reason.
Yeah.
Right?
Allow me to say something
Please,
about
yes.
the positive side. I would say the world...
Not too much positivity,
No.
James, please.
We have to balance it out a bit.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. I'm talking about the sustainability
Yep.
imperative.
Yep.
And this kind of paradoxical situation. On one hand, we have this kind of geopolitics-driven divide. On the other hand, we still see the kind of sustainability imperative driving a global collaboration. That's happening, it's going to happen, and it's happening in a big way that will change the competitive landscape, to change the business landscape, global value chain. And for that is going on, that's the positive side, create a lot of business opportunities, and we see a benefit to the community. And for that, we see the international cooperation. This is unlike the hardcore regimes, trade, and the multilateral trading system is almost
Yes.
paralyzed. And we see the investment, technology collaboration is hard to do any at global level. So that's what we have seen. I would say that's the positive side in the years to come, shaping the global supply chain, value
Yeah.
chain.
Yeah. And just a quick point on the WTO. If anyone's at any other session in Davos and anyone mentions on stage the WTO, put your hand up and say, how do we reform the WTO? All right? We absolutely need that reform if we're going to... So winners and losers. Now, you painted a slightly different paths for the future. And you've mentioned, Rupa, I'll come back to you. In some of these shifts, or with some of these shifts, there are some markets, some countries that are benefiting and going to benefit. In Asia, it might be Vietnam, you've mentioned, and Bangladesh. So that's as companies maybe do a China plus one strategy or dual supply chains, they are looking to Vietnam, Bangladesh and others to maybe minimise or manage their risk.
India too.
India too, right. So in any change, there will be some countries and maybe sectors who benefit. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. There will be sectors that benefit. You talked about some of these countries. You look at the labor force. You look at the languages that are spoken in those countries. What are they ready for? India benefited a lot on the services globalization. Infosys is a perfect example.
Right. Well, there you go. That wasn't planned, by the way, but there you go. There you go.
Because of the language. They
Yep.
were able to step in, and then you have technology.
Yep.
You have access to technology. You have access to a very phenomenal talent, engineers, for a global audience.
Yep.
If I look at manufacturing-wise Bangladesh, but then you add to the sustainability piece, things that we went through in the 70s in the US with the kind of environment these workers were working under, the conditions, a lot more effort might be needed to bring them up to speed.
Yeah.
Because what I have seen is when the economies are impacted, when they are underdeveloped, there are a lot of sacrifices people are willing to make and for the working conditions. As the economies prosper, they are less willing to do that. And not only are they less willing to do that, there is a lot of pressure from the outside to correct it.
Yeah.
So there is, I would say maybe a little bit more, again, the ever optimist, more inclusivity. Because what we found in the globalization of the past, the have and have nots,
Right.
there's a big polarity between people who have it and people who don't. What I'm hopeful about is with this change that
We do better.
The prosperity, the wealth is a little bit more evenly distributed, and it reaches out to more people rather than having a big discrepancy between those who have and those who don't.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, economists like me, we love talking about the benefits of trade. And it tends to go to the companies who can work across borders and the people in those markets who have the skills to benefit from those changes. But in this next chapter, if we can do it a little bit better, focus on both sustainability and inclusion, that would be the type of new world order that I think would be fantastic. James, winners or losers in this next chapter?
Yeah, in terms of sectors and in terms of countries. I think this, I mentioned 4 mega drivers through the 4 trajectories, and it's a mixed picture. Overall, I would say in terms of sectors, we need to look, in terms of global value chain, we need to look at the different the nature of the industries, so to speak. If we talk about primary sectors, it's locational based, location bound, so it won't have much change. And if we talk about manufacturing, and we'll see there will be kind of restructuring, kind of reallocation, that through the driver of diversification. But then for advanced manufacturing, the replication will get in for 3D printing, for all these. These are all more of less global, and it's a shorter value chain and more location-based. And if we look at the kind of, there are also type of industries, what we call multi-domestic rather than global industries. As unlike a garment, footwear, and all these, there's also industry like pharmaceuticals and like the food and beverage. This is kind of a multi-domestic industry rather than global industry. So there won't be much change in terms of patterns. It remains. Services, and then will be separate from the low value added from high value added. High value added will accelerate in terms of further offshoring, while low value added will maybe technology will take over that part. In terms of countries and regions, diversification play a role, regionalization play a role. I agree that for the time being, we have already seen that Southeast Asia has been benefiting a lot from that. And then what is happening now is the Caribbean region, led by the US. I've been visiting these countries and seeing what's going on, what is going to happen, and what has been
So
planned.
they're starting to see some benefit.
Yes, benefiting that. And then for Europe, this kind of thing is, we have a kind of Italian French for the Mediterranean, and the Germany for the eastward Europe, and the Nordics was taking care of some of the northeast of Europe. That has been the traditional, but the war has changed the pattern. I think longer term wise, they may resume that kind of a pattern. For the time being, we see the kind of, instead of west to the east investment, maybe a kind of backward east to the west a bit on that. So that's overall. But I'm just thinking technology may play an important role in reshaping. For example, there was 10 years ago, or that's 5 or 6 years ago, when we thought that the factor of production has been increased so much in China, so the investment may, and also in ASEAN countries, there may be a kind of what we call the flying geese pattern of formation, that industries labor intensive may move to Africa. So we expected that. But in fact, there's another trend, technology, the deployment of industrial robots, in thousands of them every year, that will replace the labor intensive, and that may slow down or
so the use of robots will benefit impact. Some, but obviously not all of them.
Not all of them.
Right.
And there's also what we say the general this kind of risk of disruption for supply chain. In the past, the concentration may create fewer but big disruptions. Then this redundancy and diversification will create more frequent disruptions, but in a smaller scale.
Right.
So that change we need to note. There'll be more of disruptions that companies need to be prepared. So there are a number of dimensions we need to take into account into this new pattern.
Well, James, I think we need more research, we need more events, we need more discussions, we need to keep this stuff going because this stuff is complex. Now, I have 1 or 2 last questions for the panelists, but any questions from the floor before we move on to the next panel? But any questions from the floor? Anyone would like to ask? Oh, yes, please.
Hi, my name is Ralph Heinrich. I'm also with the UN. Sorry. My name is Ralph Heinrich. I'm with the United Nations, UNECE in Geneva. I have one question to Mr. Zhang. We've spoken about the proliferation of investment treaties and frameworks, bilateral and regional. But more generally, we have a sustained effort at what we could call international economic governance, regulation in many areas, sustainability, which we're going to be talking about in the next panel, but also in the area of, say, artificial intelligence or data privacy, security, etc. So what is your take? What is what we've been talking about so far, the possible fragmentation, possible change in the nature of globalization? What does that mean for efforts at international economic governance, and particularly for efforts at regulation?
James.
Yep. As I said, we see the slowdown of the rulemaking or the policy making at the international level. On the one hand, on the other hand, we also see kind of geopolitical driven of new sets of investment rules getting in. And we see the regional blocks, the big building blocks on that. RCEP was recent, and then we have other initiatives, particularly in Asia Pacific, and then there will be also Indo-Pacific. So there will be a few kind of mega initiatives that will shape the global economic governance in the area of trade, investment, technology. That is happening as geopolitical driven. And then the current regime is really fading away while there are some massive reforms going on that facilitated by international organizations like UNCTAD, World Bank, and OECD. We're working together for the reform of international investment regime towards sustainability issues. As you see that overwhelming majority of the treaties we counted, 2,900 were concluded before the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. And in these treaties, the sustainable development word were not mentioned, are not mentioned in these treaties even. You can't imagine, and some of them are still governing the economic relations between countries. So that we are working on that. We see in the future regime, sustainability will be mainstreamed. We are doing that. In the meantime, geopolitics-driven kind of new rules and regulations, even going beyond the investment core, goes to labor, environment, standards, and all these human rights, they're all coming in.
And it raises the bar for companies. A lot of dependency was there earlier on nations to make big changes, whether it was preferences or penalties. What we have seen even with the Ukraine war, the amount of companies that it's countries putting limits to what they're going to do business with, and you can have tariffs and so on, but there are companies who walked away. They walked away from future investment in those countries. They walked away from selling to those countries where they had retail presence. They walked away. And that power has been underestimated all along. When we talk about sustainability, when you talk about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 emissions, we need to take a deeper look at ourselves from an organization perspective. It's one thing for countries to sign accords or back out of accords or terminate agreements. But if you raise the bar from organizations, from companies, there's so much more they can do. And there should be a sense of urgency. If we don't do it now, it's very hard to turn the clock back to make changes in the future. When I talk to my kids and I tell them, oh, we are counting on you guys to do A, B, and C, they look back and said, why do we have to pay for the mistakes you're making? Why don't you fix your own damn problems instead of telling us to fix it? So there has to be a little bit more seriousness in what we can do as individuals, as organizations, rather than just counting on other countries or somebody else to take the initiative. We have to take the initiative.
Absolutely.
If I may to add,
a
very important point, I just to echo what Luca said. There are three major things that are coming up in terms of, there are three major global initiatives that are coming up that the companies need to pay attention to. One is this global standards on sustainability standards for disclosure reporting. And for that, we have the ISSB, International Sustainable Standard Board. They are going to issue the global standards with the support of G20, G7, and the rest of the world and the UN. That is, S1 is on ESG, S2 is on climate. It'll be issued, launched in May this year, and then there will be two tracks. One is that to encourage and to help countries to adapt and adopt in their national system, and then it will become a mandatory for firms to report. And the second is that they have the direct market participation approach, so the markets are really getting in. IOSCO, the International Organization of Security Commissions, is supporting and will endorse it, and by then, all the market has to report on that. So that's one major thing. The second is this global minimum corporate income tax reform at the 15 level. That will impact on the investment, international investment, many, many countries, particularly for a large number of developing countries in their special economic zones. There are 7,000 in 140 countries, and they have to change their investment incentive schemes. That is fiscal incentives. There are ways and means doing that.
Because they can't rely on low tax anymore.
That's right. That's right. That's the global efforts. And then the third is the SDG, that efforts. There will be kind of a new initiatives coming up, a lot of them. I think that creates the opportunities for companies. Those are really mainstreaming sustainability into their business model.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, let's wrap it up. I think it's a great segue to our next discussion. But please join me in thanking James and Rupert for this great discussion. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.